The empath is leaving the childhood role that kept them small. And before we go anywhere near the psychology of what that actually means, I want you to sit with the word role for a moment. Not in the theatrical sense, not in the sense of a performance consciously chosen and deliberately maintained, but in the sense of something far more fundamental and far more invisible than any performance could ever be. A role in the sense of a shape you were poured into before you had the language to describe the pouring, before you had the self-awareness to notice it was happening, before you had the autonomy or the safety or the developmental capacity to question whether the shape you were being pressed into was the right shape for the person you actually were. Because that is what a childhood role is, at the psychological level where it does its most lasting work. It is not something you chose. It is something that was chosen for you by a family system that needed something from you specifically, that identified in you the particular qualities required to fill a particular function, and that rewarded you so consistently and so completely for filling that function that you eventually stopped experiencing the role as a role at all. You started experiencing it as yourself, as the simple, obvious, unquestionable truth of who you were, what you were for, what you owed the people around you in exchange for the love and the safety and the sense of belonging that every child needs more than almost anything else in the world. And that confusion between the role and the self, between the function assigned and the person underneath it, is the confusion that this episode is going to spend the next hour carefully, precisely, and without sparing anyone the discomfort of honest examination, helping you untangle. Because you cannot leave a role until you can see it, and you cannot see it until someone helps you look at it from far enough outside to recognize that it was never you. It was only ever what you were asked to be. Let's talk about what these specific roles that keep empaths small actually look like, because this is not a single shape. The family system does not produce one type of small empath through one type of role assignment. It produces several, each with its own particular signature, each requiring its own particular kind of leaving. But they all share a common structural feature that is worth naming before we examine the individual variations, because the common feature is what explains both the role's persistence into adulthood and the specific difficulty of leaving it. Every role that keeps an empath small is built on the same foundational trade. You give us something we need, and in exchange, we give you a place here. You perform the function, and in exchange, you belong. And belonging, for a child, is not a preference. It is not a nice to have, not a bonus feature of a good childhood, not something that can be adequately compensated for by other things if it is absent. It is a biological necessity. Children who do not belong to someone, who do not have a secure, reliable, unconditional place within a family system, are in genuine danger, not metaphorical danger, not emotional danger that can be managed with sufficient resilience, but the real, evolutionary, nervous system registered danger of a small creature without the protection of the group. So when the family system offers belonging in exchange for a role, the child does not evaluate the offer. The child takes it. Every time. Because the alternative is not being a more authentic version of themselves in exchange for less security. The alternative to a child's nervous system is no security at all. And no security is not a price any child can afford to pay for authenticity they don't yet know they're trading away. The first role, and the one most commonly assigned to the empath in a family system that contains emotional instability or unpredictability, is the role of the emotional regulator. The child who learned to read the room before she learned to read books. The child whose antennae were so finely calibrated to the emotional atmosphere of the household that she could sense a shift in her parents' mood from a different room, could feel tension building between adults before any words were exchanged, could adjust her own behavior, her own energy, her own emotional presentation, with the automatic precision of someone whose survival had come to depend on the accuracy of that adjustment. This child was not born a regulator. She was made into one by a family system that was not regulating itself, where one or both parents had emotional volatility, or narcissistic instability, or depression that made them unavailable, or anxiety that made the household atmosphere unpredictable, or simply the ordinary human difficulty of two adults managing the stress of adult life, without ever developing the emotional tools to do it without leaking that stress into the family system. And the most sensitive child in that system, the one most attuned, the one most perceptive, the one whose nervous system registered every shift most accurately, became, by default, and without anyone explicitly deciding this was happening, the one responsible for managing the atmosphere, for softening things when they needed to be softened, for being easy when things were hard, for bringing levity when tension was building, and providing warmth when coldness was spreading, and making herself smaller, quieter, less demanding, less needy, less herself, whenever the family system needed more room for someone else's emotional experience than it could accommodate alongside hers. This child grows into an empath who does not know how to be in a relationship without managing the other person's emotional state, who experiences someone else's discomfort as her emergency, who feels, in some deep and never examined place, that it is her job, not her choice, not her preference, not something she consciously decides to offer, but her actual job, her function, the thing she owes every relationship she enters, to make sure the emotional atmosphere is okay. And because she is good at this, extraordinarily good at it, trained from the earliest years of her life to do it with a thoroughness and a precision that most people never develop, she does it in every relationship she enters, at work, in friendships, in romantic relationships where the emotional labor she performs is so seamlessly integrated into the fabric of the connection that neither she nor her partner ever explicitly examines it until the day she cannot do it anymore, and the relationship reveals, in its sudden floundering, how entirely it was built on her invisible work. And the leaving of this role, the actual, genuine, cellular leaving of it, not the intellectual understanding that she shouldn't have to do it, but the embodied experience of being in a relationship and not orienting herself immediately and automatically toward the other person's emotional state, is one of the most disorienting experiences available to someone whose entire sense of relational identity was built around doing exactly that. Because who is she in a relationship if she is not the one managing it? What is her value if she is not performing the function? What keeps her from being abandoned, which is the original fear underneath the original trade, if she stops giving the family system, now the relationship system, the thing it required of her in exchange for her belonging? The second role, closely related to the first, but with its own distinct flavor and its own distinct damage, is the role of the family hero, the child who achieved and performed competence and was good at things in a way that reflected well on the family system and gave it something to point to with pride. This role looks, from the outside, like straightforward success. The child who gets good grades, who wins things, who is responsible beyond her years, who adults describe as so mature and so capable, who can be relied upon in ways that other children cannot yet be relied upon. From the outside, this looks like thriving. From the inside, it is often something considerably more exhausting and considerably more conditional. The experience of a child who learned that her value was contingent on her performance, that the love available to her was most reliably present when she was succeeding at something visible, that the safest version of herself was the competent version, the achieving version, the version that gave the family system something to be proud of, rather than the version that was simply, ordinarily, unremarkably herself, without any particular accomplishment to justify the space she was taking up. This child becomes an empath who cannot rest, who cannot be average at anything without a quiet internal alarm sounding that tells her that average is dangerous, that ordinary is the edge of invisible, that the moment she stops being impressively good at things is the moment the conditional love she learned to survive on gets withdrawn. She becomes someone who overfunctions in every situation, because underfunctioning to a nervous system trained in this specific role is not just disappointing, it is annihilating. And then there is the third role, the one that is perhaps the most specifically damaging for the empath's relationship with her own needs. And that is the role of the invisible child, the one who learned that the best way to belong in a family system that had no room for her was to take up as little room as possible. Not the scapegoat, who at least receives the family's negative attention, and therefore exists within the system's awareness even while being harmed by it. The invisible child, whose strategy for survival was to need nothing, to ask for nothing, to have no inconvenient emotions, no difficult requests, no demands on the family system's already stretched resources. This child did not get the role of the regulator or the hero, because neither of those roles was available or required in her particular family system. She got the role of the one who was fine, always fine, reliably, conveniently, undemandingly fine. And fine, when it is performed consistently enough and from early enough, becomes the most thoroughgoing kind of self-erasure available to a child who needed to belong in a system that could not afford to see her fully. This child becomes an adult empath who genuinely does not know what she needs. Not because she is broken, because she practiced not knowing for so long, practiced being fine with such consistency and such thoroughness that the practice became the reality. The needs did not disappear. They went underground, and they have been there ever since, waiting with the same patience that everything in her has always waited with, for the moment she stops performing fine long enough to finally, for the first time, ask herself honestly what is actually there. What all three of these roles share, and what makes leaving them so specifically difficult for the empath who has been living inside them for decades, is not just the behavioral habit of performing the function. It is the identity that grew around the performance, the self-concept that was built in the shape of the role, the answer to the question of, who am I, that has always, at its foundation, been answered by what I do for this system and how well I do it. Leaving the role does not just mean stopping the behavior. It means dismantling the identity that the behavior built and rebuilding from something underneath it that has been there all along, but has never been given enough space, enough safety, enough unconditional permission to simply exist without justifying its existence through function. And what is underneath it, what the empath finds when she finally, terrifyingly, stops performing the role long enough to discover what is there without it, is exactly where this conversation is going next. What is underneath it is not nothing. This needs to be said clearly and early, and with enough emphasis that it lands before the fear of what might be found in the absence of the role has a chance to convince you otherwise. Because the fear is real, and it arrives reliably in the early stages of leaving any deeply embedded childhood role. The fear that without the function, without the performance, without the thing you have been doing since before you had the language to describe doing it, there will be nothing there. That the role was not something layered on top of a self, but was the self, entirely, and that removing it will reveal not a person waiting to be discovered, but an absence where a person should have been. This fear is one of the most common, most consistently reported experiences of people in the process of genuine psychological individuation. The technical term for the developmental task of becoming a self that is actually yours, rather than a self that was constructed to serve the system you were born into. And it is almost never true. The absence is almost never what is actually there. What is actually there, underneath the role, underneath the function, underneath the decades of performing competence or emotional regulation or invisible fineness, is the person who was there before the role was assigned. The child who existed in the window between being born and being shaped, who had preferences before preferences became liabilities, who had needs before needs became dangerous, who had a self before the self became something that needed to be traded for belonging. That person did not disappear when the role arrived. She went quiet. She went underground. She learned to be very still and very patient and very small in the space that the role left for her, which was usually not much space at all. But she stayed. And she is the one who has been generating the low-grade discomfort, the persistent sense that something is off, the feeling that the life being lived does not quite fit the person living it, that has been running underneath everything for longer than the empath can clearly remember. Finding her, actually finding her, not just knowing intellectually that she is there, but making genuine, sustained, felt contact with the person underneath the role is the work of leaving. And it is work in the truest sense, not the motivational content version of work that sounds like it should feel empowering and directional and accompanied by a sense of progress at every stage, but real work, the kind that is unglamorous and non-linear, and frequently indistinguishable from simply being confused and uncomfortable for extended periods without a clear indication that the confusion is productive. Because the person underneath the role has been quiet for so long that she does not immediately know how to speak in full sentences when the space is finally offered. She arrives in fragments, in small, easily dismissed moments of preference. This, not that. In the sudden, surprising discomfort of a situation that the role would have handled smoothly, and the self underneath the role wants no part of. In the flicker of something that might be anger, or might be desire, or might be the particular restlessness of someone who has been still for too long and is starting, cautiously and without much confidence, to move. These fragments are not dramatic. They are not the cinematic breakthrough moments that the leaving of something this significant seems like it should produce. They are small. They arrive quietly. And the empath who is learning to leave the role has to develop a quality of attention to herself that she has historically only ever applied to other people. A willingness to notice the small signals, to take them seriously, to treat the whisper of her own preferences and discomforts and desires as information worthy of the same careful consideration she has always given to everyone else's. This quality of attention to the self is what psychologists call interoceptive awareness, the ability to accurately read and interpret the signals coming from inside the body rather than from the environment outside it. And for the empath, who has spent her developmental years oriented almost entirely outward, whose perceptive apparatus was trained from the beginning to read external emotional signals with exquisite accuracy, while her own internal signals went largely unmonitored and unresponded to. Interoceptive awareness is not a skill she has developed. It is a skill she has to build, consciously and deliberately, in the same way that any skill that was never practiced has to be built, slowly, with inconsistency, with frequent returns to the starting point that feel like failure, but are actually just the nature of learning something from the ground up in adulthood that should have been developed in childhood, but wasn't, because the childhood was too busy requiring her to look outward to allow her the safety of looking in. What building this skill looks like in practice is not complicated, though it is consistently uncomfortable in the beginning. It looks like pausing in the middle of a situation where the role would automatically activate and asking a question she has rarely been in the habit of asking. Not, what does this person need from me? Not, what does this situation require of me? Not, what is the right way to handle this that will preserve the dynamic and protect everyone's comfort and demonstrate the particular quality of selflessness that has always been her most reliable credential for belonging. The question is simpler and harder than any of those. The question is, what do I actually feel right now? Not what should I feel? Not what would be the appropriate response to this? What is actually, specifically, happening inside me in this moment before I do anything about what is happening outside me? That question, asked honestly and answered honestly, without immediately converting the answer into a justification for someone else's needs, is the beginning of everything. Because here is what starts happening when the empath begins to genuinely leave the childhood role. When the leaving moves from intention into practice, and the practice starts accumulating into something that changes the actual texture of daily experience. The relationships in her life begin to reorganize around the change in a way that is both clarifying and, in many cases, genuinely painful. Because the relationships that were built on the role, that were organized around her specific function within them, that required her to be the regulator or the overfunctioner or the invisible accommodator in order to maintain their current form. These relationships do not automatically upgrade when she does. They resist. Not always consciously, not always with visible hostility, though sometimes with both of those things. They resist in the way that any system resists the change of a component that the system's functioning has come to depend on, with pressure, with the subtle and not so subtle application of whatever pressures have historically been most effective at returning her to the role. Guilt for the people who learned that guilt moves her. Withdrawal for the people who learned that the threat of distance activates her compliance more reliably than direct confrontation. The sudden, specific helplessness of someone who has always been helped by her and is now making very clear, through their performance of inability, that they expect to continue being helped. These pressures are not new. They are the same pressures that maintained the role throughout her life. What is new is that she can now see them for what they are, not genuine expressions of need that she is obligated to meet, but the system's attempt to restore a function it has come to rely on. And seeing them clearly does not make them comfortable to sit with, but it makes them possible to sit with without automatically capitulating to them, which is different from anything that was available to her before. What becomes available on the other side of this, not at the end of the leaving, because leaving a childhood role is not a process with a clear ending, but in the ongoing, accumulating, gradually stabilizing experience of someone who is doing the work of it consistently, is something that the empath has been seeking in every external relationship, every external validation, every external source of belonging that the role was designed to secure. What becomes available is the experience of belonging to herself. Not as a concept, not as something she has been told she should feel, and has always found slightly abstract when she tries to locate it in actual experience, but as a genuine, felt, daily reality. The experience of being the first place her own allegiance lands, of making decisions that begin with her own internal experience rather than ending there, if they arrive there at all, of entering relationships not from the position of someone who needs to perform a function in order to justify her presence, but from the position of someone whose presence is already justified, already whole, already complete, before a single thing has been done or given or managed or regulated on anyone else's behalf. This is what it means to belong to yourself. And for the empath who built her entire relational life around belonging to systems in exchange for the function she performed within them, this experience is so foreign and so profound that the first times it arrives, it is often not recognized as what it is. It feels at first like something is missing, like the familiar weight of the role has been lifted, and the body doesn't know yet what to do with the lightness. Like something that should feel like freedom hasn't yet learned to feel like anything other than the absence of what was there before. But the lightness doesn't stay unfamiliar. It becomes, over time, and with the accumulation of genuine self-referencing, something she starts to recognize, and then something she starts to trust, and then something she starts, quietly, and without needing anyone else to witness it, to protect. Because the self that was underneath the role this whole time, the one who had preferences before preferences were liabilities, who had needs before needs were dangerous, who was a person before being a person required a function to justify it. That self, when she is finally given the space and the safety and the permission to fully arrive, is not small. She was made small by the role. She was pressed into a shape that required her to be smaller than she was in order to fit the space that the family system had available for her. but she was never actually small. And the empath who finally leaves the childhood role that kept her that way does not become someone new on the other side of the leaving. She becomes, for the first time in her adult life, the full size of who she actually is. And that size, the real, uncompressed, unaccommodated, finally given room to expand size of a person who feels everything, sees everything, understands everything, and is no longer required to make herself less than any of that in exchange for a belonging that was always, finally, unconditionally hers to begin with. That size is not something the people and systems that needed her small are going to find comfortable. But it is something she is, at long last, no longer willing to sacrifice for their comfort. And that unwillingness, quiet as it is, steady as it is, unhurried and unperformative, and completely, irrevocably real, that unwillingness is the leaving. That is what it looks like when an empath stops being small. Not a declaration, not a confrontation, just the simple, permanent, life-changing decision to finally, fully take up the space she was always supposed to occupy.